Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special episode of the Third Way podcast. I have switched formats to basically doing these episodes when I feel like it around people that I admire or I find interesting, or I feel like I have something extra special to share with the world. And so today is no exception to that. I'm joined by who is someone that's become a very dear friend. We were strangers this time last year, and now we've become very close friends. I'm joined from India by my dear friend Mohan. Hello, Mo. Welcome to my podcast.
Thank you, Justin. How have you been?
We've been good. I've been good. It's cold here. For Austin's weather, it's cold.
I can imagine, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we met through a friend of mine I've known for many years, Stacy Ennis, and it's funny how international we are because I'm in Austin, you're in India, she's in Portugal. But she and I met many years ago in Boise, Idaho. She actually edited my first book, Oatmeal versus Bacon. And you found her, and she sent you to me. And you told me this amazing story that even today, after the thousands of hours probably we spent together working on this project, it gives me the chills. But we're going to get to that part of the story in a little bit. I would love to because, I'm a white dude from America, and there's many things that I don't have a lot of global experience. And so I'm really curious for you to share a little bit about your background growing up in India, your kind of journey to becoming a businessman and kind of getting up until the point that your first daughter, Yogita, was born, because that kind of then changed everything for you. So talk a little bit about your background up until that point.
Yeah, I was born in a large Hindu giant family. Do you know anything about Hindu giant families? Have you heard about Hindu giant families? Well,
No.
the house where I was born, there are 22 of us together in one house under one roof.
Wow.
Okay. My father settled down in Mysore in 1947. He started his own business, and I am the last of the nine children.
Mm,
My eldest sister was born 22 years before I was born.
mm,
So you can imagine. I have seven brothers and two sisters. So I grew up, I did my schooling in Mysore, I did my college in Mysore, I did my engineering in electrical, then I did my master's in business administration. My father had this incense business, which was doing very well, but I was not very keen to join the family business. I went and became a teacher in an engineering college called B.V. Bammareddy Engineering College in Hubli. And then my brother said, come on back here and join the family business because I was already a partner there, an equal partner. So I joined family business in 1983
mm,
and I was 25 at the time. I started I took up on the responsibility of diversification because we wanted to reduce our dependence on one industry. So I started a food industry, I started a pharmaceutical industry, and I started an aerosol industry, which all did pretty well. And within 4 years, I established them, and then I decided to marry, and I got married in 1988. I was 30 when I got married. Up until then, I was this kind of free spirited kind of a Casanova kind of a guy traveling, having flings, having weekend parties and things like that. I never saw grief. I never knew what tragedy meant. The closest I ever came to crying was when my father died when I was 22. So I had really not seen grief in any
mm,
form.
mm,
And then when my first child was born, when I was 31, it came as a shock that she was born blind.
mm,
And we discovered that when she was 4 days old.
mm,
And then I was shocked because my wife was 19 when I met her, and she was 21 when she gave birth to Yogita, my first daughter.
mhm,
And I was completely taken aback, and I was a combination of feelings of guilt, of self blame, self pity, bitterness, jealousy, complexity of emotions, and underwent hell. I
mm.
gave up drinking. I started blaming myself that this was kind of a divine retribution for all the bad things that I'd done. The biggest thing was that I indulged in a lot of self blame.
So from a cultural standpoint, because I think most of my listeners are from the United States. And you and I have had many conversations about kind of the difference between the Eastern mind and the Western mind, but it's also the social conditioning. So if I ask questions that may seem ignorant, it's because they are, but not ignorant in the sense and intention of like, so Mysore is in southern India, correct?
Yes.
And in southern India, as you when you were growing up, at least, and maybe it's still like this, was the caste system that we read about, was that a thing? Was that a present thing in southern India?
Yeah, it was there, but it was not as pronounced or not as exaggerated as it is now.
Really? Okay.
It is
So
yeah, yeah,
it was
because of
less
the,
than.
it was less than, because the politicians, they want to divide and rule, and they need a particular cash for their vote banks. So it's kind of a more of a political thing that
Hmm,
the casteism has gone where it has gone in India today.
hmm,
Back then, when I was growing up, the only thing that is, what is your dharma? I would say I'm a Brahmin, but I didn't make anything out of my caste or anybody else's caste, or we didn't sit in judgment of anybody based on the
hmm,
caste. We had Muslim workers in our incense factory. We had Hindus from lower caste,
hmm,
socially backward people, but we gelled with everybody. We ate together and we played together. We never had those things.
hmm.
It's only now that the media has also exaggerated it. It's now, but it was less pronounced then, back
Yeah.
then. But
And
it did exist. Yes, yes.
what was your growing up and in that time of your life up until, Yogita was born, what was your relationship with religion or faith, let's say?
Well, when I was a teenager, I became wary of the religion because my grandmother was very strict. She wouldn't let us have lunch without doing the prayer, and then without taking the tirtha, which is called this kind of a holy water in Hinduism. So
Hmm,
a purohit, a priest, holy priest, would come home. He would conduct the rituals, and until he came, conduct the rituals and offer the holy water, we were not supposed to eat.
hmm.
And I would be hungry like crazy. So I always looked upon these kinds of rituals with disdain, and I didn't respect them as much as I did. The second thing that used to really, really put me off was whenever the maid servant at our house, she used to pass by the prayer room where my grandmother used to pray. She had to cover her face and pass by. She
Hmm,
was not allowed to take a peep into the prayer room
hmm,
because she came from a caste much lower. My grandmother was extremely orthodox,
hmm,
and she was believed in, once she took bath, she wouldn't touch anybody because she considered herself holy. She was
hmm,
75 at the time. And then every year a retinue of people would come from some mutt, which is equivalent of a kind of a church. You have different churches, so we had 8 mutts, and one or the other Swamiji would come, and then they would come with a retinue of people, and he would chant Sanskrit slokas all day long, and he wouldn't let us eat. So
hmm,
somehow I was very wary of these rituals. I somehow did not enjoy any of those practices that were observed at home,
hmm,
and so I didn't have much respect for my religion or the culture
hmm.
or anything at all like that.
Yeah. I think that, I say this, I'm not Jewish, but my friends that are Jewish, sometimes they refer to themselves as they're culturally Jewish. It's not like a religious thing, it's a cultural thing. So it sounds like you were kind of culturally Hindi or believed in Hinduism. Is that a correct assumption or correct way to say it? That it was part of the culture, but it wasn't part of your identity?
Well, yes. If somebody asked me what is the religion, I would say I'm a Brahmin, and
Mm,
I wouldn't say I'm a practicing Hindu
mm.
because I didn't do any of the rituals.
Right.
I didn't pray
Right.
every day. Yes, I was not a practicing Hindu in the true sense of the word, but I would call myself a Brahmin from the Hindu religion.
Mm, okay.
That was about the closest I ever got to my identity.
So Yogita was born. This was in the early 90s, and she was born blind. And one of the things that you've shared with me, and this is going to be in what much greater detail in your book, Myopia, that will be out soon, probably April. And so this is a little, there's a lot more detail to the story, but what was the reason why you had the reaction that you had to her being blind? Why was it so devastating?
For one, for starters, she happened to be the first blind person I ever met in my life.
Oh, wow.
Up until then, I had not even touched a blind person. I would just see some people crossing the street with a white cane, but that was about the closest that had ever gone to meeting with a blind person. The second reason, like I told you, I have six brothers and two sisters, and all told, I have 22 nephews and nieces. Okay, 22.
Mm-hmm.
So when the 23rd child is born with a problem that none of our cousins had,
Mm.
obviously, like I was one of the 30 guys standing in line, and the shit falls and it falls only on my head.
Yeah.
You know how the mind works, that you need answers, you need certainty.
Right.
You always have this question of why me.
Right.
So when this happened, I was myopic. That's why I call my book Myopia. And I was so myopic that I had to know, I got to know, there was a need for me to know why it happened only to me and not any of my six brothers or my two
Mm.
sisters or my cousins or my nephews or anybody. So I just had to know. And the more and more I pondered, I ruled out Mamta because she was pristine, pure, innocent. She was only 19 when I met her. But I was. I had frequent fights with my brothers. I was kind of a renegade. I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to join the family business. I had flings before marriage. I had premarital sex. I had slept with a prostitute. I'd done so. I'd even been nasty with a dog. So there's so many bad things that I had done that I said this has to be something that I did in my past, because
Mm.
we Hindus believe in the concept of karma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like you read what you, well, it's a very complex term, but for my simple mind at that time, I said it has to be karmic retribution, it has to be karmic payback. It is a
Mm.
divine retribution that I am the only son of N Rangarao whose child is born blind, and the reason could not be anything else but something that I have done in my past.
Mm.
So I said it is retribution, and I had this complex combination of feelings and emotions and bitterness, like I told you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that led to you going on a journey. Some of it is documented in a literal journey that you took many years later in a book you wrote called Inner Trek, which is fascinating, and
Mhm.
I'll link to that in the show notes. And I want to save the story of in between that first few years of of Yogita's birth and adjusting to her blindness to an even greater tragedy that emerged. Share a little bit about that.
Well, I have written it in my book. What happened was this. So, after Yogita was born, we were happy left to ourselves. It is only when we saw other children of Yogita's age
Mm-hmm.
that I used to feel jealous. I used to feel bitter. And then it so happened that when Yogita was at around one and a half, the National Blind Association asked me to meet somebody. And I met that man, and it came as a kind of a divine intervention, because he had two sons, and both of them were blind.
Mm. And he was an
And
Indian.
yeah, and I've written it in my book too. And one was 12 and the other one was 10. They were so happy. So the boys were singing, they sang me a song. And
Mm-hmm.
then I came back and said, what am I doing? Because they were very happy. And left to ourselves, we were always happy. Yogita never knew what it meant not to see.
Right.
It was we were feeling sorry for her.
Mm-hmm.
It was we were pitying. The world was pitying her.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't need pity. She didn't need sympathy. She wanted to understand. She needed understanding. She needed empathy. So that was kind of a mini transformation. And then Mamta was bold enough, my wife Mamta, and she went ahead and had more children, and we had two more kids. And what happened was, when Yogita was a beautiful, healthy child, and when she turned 8 years and 2 months to be precise, suddenly she got a bout of fever, and again a repeated bout of fever, 3 4 times, and then the lymph nodes started swelling. And then what is the problem? So by till then I had just taken her to a pediatrician. He gave her some antibiotics, and again when it recurred, he said, "Why don't you get a blood test done?" So I went. As it happened, I never ever had prayed in my life, and on that Sunday morning, it was a coincidence, because I didn't know that anything was wrong with Yogita. It was that Mamta said, "Why don't we? Today is Ganesha Chaturthi. It was a big, huge festival for us Hindus. It's called Ganesha Chaturthi. We worship Lord Ganesh." She said, "Why don't you do it today, Mohan? You have never ever heard a prayer or ritual in your life. So I sat down with the three kids with Mamta, and for 2 hours I prayed with all my heart. I did all the ritual using a tape recorder, and then we went for Yogita's blood test. It was, I so distinctly remember, it was exactly at 9 o'clock in the morning when we went after the puja and gave the blood test. They asked me to come because it's only TCDC, total count and differential count, nothing else. Just a simple blood test. They said, come, it is a very simple test, come after 1 hour. So we went for a drive around Mysore city. I went back at 10. He said, come back after half an hour. I went back at 10:30. Then again said, come back after 1 hour. I didn't understand. Then I went back again at 11:30. It happened many times, like this, 3, 4 times. And finally, they said, please, you have to wait till the doctor comes, the big pathologist, which was at 12 o'clock. So we waited till he came. And then he said, he called me inside and said, who is this girl? I said, she is my daughter. There's a huge problem with this. I said, what is the problem? I was shocked, and she said, she has stage 4 cancer. She has leukemia. And, I was, it was one of the most, never in my life had such a bolt from the blue ever. I didn't know what to do because my other two kids were in the car, clapping hands, listening
Hmm.
to music, the car running. Mamta was sitting there. Now, how would I go back? How could I go back and break the news?
Hmm.
All the three kids were in the car. And then I had to do that. I written all these details in my book.
Hmm.
And then again, the self blame started because what happened was when Yogita was a year old, I had taken her to Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota,
Hmm.
and they saw a small mass, a
Hmm.
white mass. Forgive my pronunciation. I'm an Indian. I tend to
That's okay.
not okay. So there was a small mass in the left eye, a white mass. They said we need to remove our eyeballs. I said there's no way that I'm going to let you take out our eyeballs. Not at 1 hour. I couldn't even think of that. I didn't tell Mamta too. Said we have to take out and send it for biopsy because any mass, even though how small it was, just as small as a mustard seed,
Hmm.
which needs to be investigated. I said, no, I'm not going to let you take out my daughter's eyes. And I came back. And probably, it could be a tumor. They said it could be a tumor. So probably it was a tumor, and maybe it was a carcinogenic tumor, malignant, I don't know. And she got cancer. So again, the self blame started.
Hmm.
Oh, maybe I should have got her eyes removed.
Hmm.
So I went through these complex emotions again. And then within 4 months, imagine a skeleton and shrink wrap it with a plastic. She became like that.
Hmm.
She could count the number of bones on her body. She was scratching all over. She was bleeding. She was shitting blood. She was vomiting blood. And she just couldn't see the most horrible, terrible 3.5 months of my life. And then she died in December, on December 19,
So 19.
1997.
Right. And
And
so
then
that.
again, I went through a lot of grief. And like I told you many times, there was a combination of feelings like relief,
Hmm.
grief, sadness, and then again guilt, because there's a sense of relief that she's gone, our suffering has ended, and again there will be self blame because how can you even think like that? So it was a
Hmm.
complex web of emotions, and I went through hell. Then I fell into depression, clinical depression, and all that. It's all in the book.
Yeah, it's all in the book. Yeah. I've heard you tell the story many times, and it's still, there's no words for
Yeah,
that. And so you did something that I would say most people don't do. And so there's a sense with many people that undergo a tragedy, they sort of pave over it. They don't really move on. You don't really move on from that, but they kind of pave over it. And there's memorials and stuff, and I don't fault them. I don't judge them. We all do what we do to get through whatever we're going through. Some people do a little bit of what you did is you started a foundation and you started to create awareness, but you use this, both her blindness and then her death and then your own torment from that and all those huge feelings, and you used it to learn how to basically understand the role of grief. And when we first met, I was so struck by how rare that was that you are one of the few people that has lived out the tattoo I have on my arm that says the mission is in the suffering. And this is documented some in your book Inner Trek. It's very well documented in your upcoming book Myopia. So as kind of a transition is, why did you call the book Myopia? Obviously there's a
Well,
play there with her being born blind, but it's a metaphor, but why that one? And what was your
yeah, why
intention?
myopia? Yeah, that's a great question because see what happens when you're undergoing any event. There are negative events all the time. Okay, as an Indian, let me set the semantics right. When we say suffering, there is a verb suffering and there's a noun suffering.
Mm-hmm.
You say, I underwent great suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Then you say, I suffered. So I say, one is a verb, one is a noun. One way or the other, it is very important to recognize that suffering is not an occurrence, suffering is not an event. Suffering is a human mental reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Mind does what it does. The mind labels events as negative. The mind labels this as negative, and then mind reacts the way it reacts with sadness, with grief. These are all mental reactions to events that happen in life. Now, what happens is when you are undergoing suffering, when you are undergoing these adversities, you tend to not see beyond because you're not, the mind is not in a position to look beyond. Because there are people who will come and very give simplistic advice like this too shall pass. There is a reason for this.
Yeah.
She is in a better place. She is in a better place.
Right.
This sounds so banal. It sounds so facile, you know. So, but I realized that if you go to a yogi, if you go to a guru, they would not have undergone any adversities, negative events in their lives. So if you go to them, they have knowledge. They have read books. They know how to meditate. They
Right.
know how to do breath watching, and they will know how to see God. But they would not have undergone real strife like normal humans do. Suffering is a part of life. So I call myself like a mate, man with awful and terrible experiences.
Mm.
The advantage with a person who has terrible experiences, awful experiences, is that he has been there and he has known what it means
Mm-hmm.
when adverse events happens. So I realized that I was being myopic
Mm.
when negative events were happening because I indulge in self blame, self pity. Why me? This is not should not be happening. Jealousy. If I had my way, I wished at one time that all children in the world would be born blind. Can you
Mm.
believe that?
Mm.
Such does the mind work.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I said when you are undergoing, when negative events happen in your life, it could be even as little as tiny as a morning anxiety. The mind is in a fog. It will not see beyond the fog of anxiety. It's very hard to take out a part of you and witness the fog
Mm-hmm.
because you become the fog and therefore you become myopic.
Mm-hmm.
When adverse events are happening, when negative events are happening, when you are suffering, you tend to become myopic. So when I said I call the book Myopia, not referring to myopia, an eye condition,
Right.
but myopia, the spiritual condition of not having the mental capacity to see beyond what is happening. So
Mm.
I realized that, like I said, I wanted to be a mate, a man with terrible experience that I should share.
Mm-hmm.
And then after I took up meditation and I also read books and I gathered a lot of knowledge about the Eastern philosophy, I had both. I had first-hand experience of facing and overcoming adverse challenges and adversities, as well as the knowledge how to create that part of the mind which you can remove and start witnessing what is happening, which is
Mm-hmm.
very tough.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought
Yeah.
that I should share this. And when I spoke to Stacy, and she said, yes, you should become an influencer because this is something that you should share with the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And thus,
And here we are. Yeah.
here
And
we
I
are.
think,
And I had a great friend who came out with a fantastic name for American myopia. The
yes.
short form of American myopia is Amopia.
Yes. That's funny. So we're going to get into that in a second, but I want to give context to something too that, or contrast to something that you, you developed over the years in your wrestling with your own grief and your mind and everything you were saying. You developed a practice that worked for you, that was a kind of a
Mhm.
growth practice, and you know that it's evolutionary. But it all started with exploration, and
Mhm.
it was not to change. You couldn't change what happened. You couldn't change what happened, but you
No,
could
of course.
study how you reacted to it, and you developed a practice that it's maybe a bit of a shorthand to say that you went from this like hard charging businessman, and there's still some of that in you. I get to see that
Mhm.
sometimes, but there's this the best word, and I know it's an overused word in English, but it's you, but kind of a very zen, centered, accepting, joyful, even, and with an extraordinary sense of humor. You're one of the funniest people I know, and considering
Thank
everything you've been through, it's not a coping
You're
mechanism.
flattering me, just you're flattering me.
I know, I'm just telling you. And so
Mhm.
this is what I'm getting to. And again, it's from the Western mind, kind of the combination of like therapy, and I'm very pro therapy. And, you know, I'm very like, if you need antidepressants or anti-anxiety medicine, I take Wellbutrin and Lexapro for those things. And mine was born of childhood trauma. But what you did is you transcended coping mechanisms. And there's very few people that do that, because you have to go deep and you've got to go far to do that.
Mhm.
And so this journey that eventually led to us meeting in person in the summer, last summer, I think it was May, as I recall, here in Austin. And we had a number of conversations up until that point. And we started basically, for a day, I did this extraction from you. And those of those of you that are listening that are my clients or people I've mentored, you're familiar with this extraction process. It's you know, there's a little bit of Rick Rubin and a little bit of coal miner in there, and
You did a fantastic job. In
it
fact, you did open up, took out it helped me a lot in removing the layers of the onion, you know.
mm-hmm,
It's like not like onion. I would like it to compare it with pomegranate. You know, pomegranate
mm-hmm,
where all the fruits are
yep,
hidden, you have to really take it out.
yeah, yeah,
You did a great, fantastic job of doing that.
yeah. Thank you. And
Yep.
so we began to do that. We began to like pick the seeds out of the pomegranate and began to look at things, and like, what is this? And I knew it was more than a book, and I knew that it was more than we're going to go brand Mohan as some new guru. And part of that was I didn't want to do that, but thank God you didn't want to do that. Like, you were very reticent to the idea of this being about you, which is always the sign of an actual mystic, is when they don't want it to be about them. And
Yeah.
so in there was a moment where I still have the picture from the whiteboard that we started trying to name this thing that you'd created, and ended up being essentially the opposite of myopia, spiritual myopia, to what we now call amopia. And amopia is a basically a blending of the Latin root of love and vision, or love and sight, amor and amopia, or opia, which is vision. And Amopia was born. And so since this, and this is kind of our first public conversation about this, like on a recording, you've been back to the States, and we hosted a kind of a happy hour get together where you answered some questions with my friends here. And so I want to kind of shift the conversation in this last bit to really what Amopia is. I'm going to have you answer it in kind of three ways. So there's Amopia, the philosophy, and then there's Amopia, um, the well, there's, let's just say, two ways. There's Amopia, the philosophy, and then there's Amopia, the company or the brand. And since we're building this together, you know, this is more of a conversation, since I know the answers to this, but I think it's really important for people to hear it from you. Starting with is, how would you describe Amopia as a philosophy or a school of thought?
Yeah. See, Amopia is basically a philosophy or a concept that says that suffering, as people perceive it, is not a negative event.
Mm-hmm.
Suffering, of course, when I say suffering, suffering as the world understands it. So we should get the semantics right here.
Yes.
Because suffering, people make it people independent. Suffering is not people independent. Suffering is a human reaction. Like
Mm-hmm.
I told you, it's the mind that reacts. There is pain. Pain is God made. Suffering is man made. So events happen in life, negative events happen in life, adversities or whatever. We always tend to label them as negative when adversities happen. And then we tend to suffer because the mind is conditioned to label things. The kind of mind has to be certain about the outcome. The mind has to feel comfortable. It wants to be peaceful all the time. Life is not, life is a suffering. Like dukkha, we call it what we call dukkha in Buddhism. Life is nothing but suffering, and
Hmm.
there are glimpses of free suffering free. What happens is it's called samsara. When you have worldly duties, when you have responsibilities, when you have bills to pay, when you have a wife to take care of, your children to take care of, you have those responsibilities and they are really stressful. You need to accomplish so many things. So you will be disappointed, you will be failure, there will be grief, there will be losses. People will, well, as you age, they die, and people around you die, and negative the adversities happen in life, and invariably life is full of suffering. Now either you learn from it or you run from it. Now I was always questioning and questioning and questioning about why bad things are happening to me, why negative thing, why me, why me, why me. Now after 30, 25, 30 years looking back, now I realize that suffering is not something that happened to me. That is the mind that played tricks with me, and that I was reacting in a manner that was not at all
Hmm.
the way that it should have been. So I
Hmm.
wanted to start a movement where we say that suffering is not something that is beyond you. Suffering is something that you do yourself. And to that extent, suffering is sacred, because when you undergo suffering, when the mind undergoes all these coping mechanisms, it kind of tempers you. It kind of
Hmm.
makes you stronger. It brings in resilience. It makes a better person out of you. It brings about spiritual evolution. So suffering is sacred, is something that I recognize and I realize that don't look down upon suffering, don't sidestep, don't avoid it.
Hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
learn from
Yeah.
how to deal with it, how to live with suffering. It's like you said. I'm not saying that there is pain and that you should be laughing at pain. You cannot laugh at pain. You will cry, but the tears will come. But you don't have to suffer.
Right.
Just like physical pain, there is mental suffering because of the stress, which is brain related. There's so many the ways that the brain makes the mind react. So you will have anxiety, you will have depression, you will have nervousness. You cannot help. That is because ultimately mind to a large extent is a victim of the brain.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
you need to understand that it's though mind is not a puppet, you need to understand that it is in the victim of the brain to a large extent, and the mind has the capacity and the power, even though it's a victim, sidestep and do something about it and witness it and understand that this is a reaction that the mind is making, and then
Right.
decide not to suffer. So
Yeah.
this is something that I decided that I should share with the world.
Hmm.
How one should cope with when negative bad events happen, when adversities happen. You don't have to suffer, but if you do suffering, you have to recognize and realize that suffering is sacred because it tempers you. It's an automatic human reaction. All
Hmm.
these kind of jealousy,
Yeah.
self pity, anger.
Right.
So it tempers you, and it conditions you to be prepared for what comes next, which is another suffering. You get over
Right.
one, you get another one. You get over that, it's a series of events that will happen in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so challenging to, and I say this through like Western culture, but especially American culture, which is still very influenced by primarily Christianity and Christian views on suffering. And there's this tendency, it's like these kind of two camps that we find ourselves in often, and one is kind of the secular camp of it's just is it's a that's what coping mechanisms are for, or there it's they they see it as they try to think their way out of it. They try to use intellectual bypassing, and it's really just a way to avoid the feeling of grief and to feel the sharp edge of it. And then on the other hand, on the more the religious side, and especially Christian, is this view of suffering as sort of karmic, as God's will, but not like you're being punished. It's like, well, now you know what Jesus felt like. And I remember when I was a kid, and you know this, and most people that listen to my podcast know this. I grew up in a Christian cult, a fundamentalist cult, and I would tell the ministers some of the ministers, I would say, well, I get migraines. And they would say, well, now you know how a little bit how Jesus felt on the cross, which is really exactly what a 10-year-old kid wants to hear.
I know, but Justin, wait a minute. Even Christianity, Jesus Christ, he underwent a hell of a lot of pain, but he didn't suffer.
Right.
You cannot
He
call
didn't
it
suffer.
suffering. He
Yeah, I know, but
embraced the pain. He was
yes,
crucified. And
yes,
in fact, even Christianity says that suffering is sacred because Jesus underwent that.
yes.
But
But
like you
my
said,
point is that there's a general sense of like a combination of either avoidance or like processing. They use this phrase.
binary, yeah.
I'm still processing. And
Hmm.
what I love about what you're doing and how almost controversial it is saying no, it's sacred. It's embracing it because in many ways it's evolutionary. It's it's we're the field of evolutionary psychology is fairly new, but one of the things, and you kind of go to like the kind of the godfather of this, even though he didn't call himself this, but was Nietzsche. He studied suffering extensively, or Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning, also a psychologist, and they both arrived, and others arrived at this idea that there's something on the other side of it that you learn about yourself that is liberating, and that it is the avoidance of it, either the avoidance of suffering altogether, or when you do feel grief or heavy, dark feelings, to try to bypass them, deny them, suppress them, whatever. You're missing the point. I'm struck by this too because I just wrote a song. I haven't sent it to. I only sent it to Virginia, but it's called "Sometimes It Takes a Heartache." And the point is that you don't have contrast without some suffering, without some pain. You don't
Yep,
know. Like if we didn't know about time, we could be all stressed out and time management and everything. But if we didn't know about time, we wouldn't appreciate moments. Or if we couldn't
yep,
feel physical pain, we wouldn't appreciate limits. If we didn't age, we wouldn't appreciate the wisdom that comes with aging. Like there's so many things like this that are non-binary, spiritual in their essence. And so with Amopia, the philosophy, because this is not something where you went and you climbed on top of to the top of a mountain and some guru told you this is the way it is. You discovered this or curated it, might be a better word, but I would love to have you share kind of like the underpinnings of it. Like I know that the kind of the aspect of, well, let's just start with the one around like quantum science. Like we're talking
hmm,
about suffering, but quantum science is part of this. So let's start there. But just kind of talk your
okay,
way through the various kind of fundamental underpinnings of Amopia as a philosophy.
yeah. So let's just to tell you I agree that it was Friedrich Nietzsche who said, "Amor
Mm-hmm.
fati, love your fate, love your fate." And he said that suffering is similarly suffering is he didn't say sacred, but suffering is inevitable, and suffering
Mm-hmm.
is something that is in your fate. So better learn to accept it and enjoy it. And one of the things that is very critical to understand that I realized in life. Like I told you, suffering is inevitable, and when it is happening, we tend to be when negative, bad events happen, we tend to be myopic, and we need to have equip ourselves, arm ourselves with our attitude. We have a perspective, like you said, a binary perspective, good,
Mm-hmm.
bad,
Mm-hmm.
positive, negative. But life is not that simple. So we should stop labeling events and we should understand what exactly is happening. Now, we have labeled many things: disappointment, grief, failure, betrayal, so many things. So, if you really, really change your perspective, shift your perspective, okay, from one of bitterness and one of negativity, and instead of asking why it happened or feeling bad or bitter about whatever has happened, if you really go deep into it, you will see there is a purpose, hidden purpose, and
Yeah,
whatever happened.
you bumped the
Yeah.
microphone. Move the microphone back. I think you bumped it with your hand. No, I
Okay,
can't hear
now.
you. Scoot it towards you.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Keep going.
See, one of the things that really motivated me was there is a Kannada is my mother tongue. There is a saying in Kannada that says, "Adatella olite ayitu," which means whatever happened happened for the good.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very profound statement that I realized when I look back. You look back, let me ask you, look back at your suffering, okay? Any event that you thought you really, really
Mm-hmm.
suffered. And if you look back, maybe now or maybe later, you try to connect the dots, there will be dots that you can connect.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
will have propelled you, that would have propelled you and orchestrated you into doing something which is better for the world, better for the mankind, better for you, and better for the society. You really need to dig deep into it to understand that whatever you thought when you were undergoing pain, when you were at the dentist and they were grilling your teeth and you came out with better teeth out of the dentist, similarly in
Mm-hmm.
life,
Yeah.
you look back on the negative events and then sit and contemplate, you see the dots filling in. But the challenge is when these things are happening to you, when somebody betrays you, it's so hard because the mind takes over. But if you recognize that betrayal also has a purpose, disappointment also has a purpose. So I realize that all these things that the mind tends to label as negative, I wrote down 13 principles.
Before
13,
before we get to
basically
the
best.
principles, though, yeah, I want to go back though
Yeah.
to kind of the lineage though before we get to the 13 principles because
Okay.
we're not going to cover
Yeah.
those
So,
on this podcast because I want people to go to your website. But so I'm just going to list them and you can react to them.
hmm,
One is there's a amalgamation of various, let's call them spiritual practices. So you have Hinduism, of course. You've got some Buddhism in here. You've got some Stoicism. You got some mysticism. But there is definitely, and my
even
question
quantum
to you this,
physics. Yeah.
huh? Well, I'll
And
get
even
to
quantum
the science.
physics.
Yeah, I'll get to the science in a second. But I guess I'm asking this as kind of a questioner representing everybody listening to this. There are spiritual aspects of Amopia as a philosophy, but it doesn't require you to have a spiritual background. Is that correct? Like someone could
That's right.
be
See, there is,
an
yeah, let's get to,
like a very secular atheist. They shouldn't be
yep,
intimidated by the word spiritual in this case.
absolutely. That is my point. So I would urge you not to use the word spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe even philosophical is okay, but don't use the word spiritual because the minute you talk of spirituality, you see like a Indian guru sitting in lotus position with eyes
Yeah.
closed. So that's not how it
Especially when they have
perceived
an
at
Indian
all.
accent. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very easy to say
But
spirituality is about the body,
yeah.
but very few people, the minute you use the word spirituality, you have brackets within which
Right.
it's a false. So I urge
Yeah.
you not to use the word spirituality and just stick to simple philosophy, a
Yeah.
new approach to life.
Yeah. But from a science perspective, you talked about quantum theory and the nature of reality.
Hmm.
It's my understanding that Amopia it kind of fits into also like complexity science is that suffering is part of what connects us all. It makes us so when it's a revelation of our interconnectedness.
Hmm.
But I'm curious, what more is there related to quantum theory in particular? Because
Yeah,
that phrase, ironically, is sort of thrown around, and I know you're not throwing it
yeah,
around. It's
yeah.
like
In fact,
spirituality. Yeah, I would tell you, you tell me not to use spirituality, and I tell you not to use quantum theory, but we're doing it anyway. So that's okay.
okay, but it's, well, you need to have a word for it. How
Yeah, of
particles
course.
behave, yeah, how
Yeah.
microparticles behave. So, you want of a better word, you say quantum. Quantum means quanta, small particle. See, there is
Yeah.
this book called Biology of Belief by Lipton. In that
Hmm.
book, he has tried to address and he has tried desperately to see what is the connection between collapsing of the wave and the biology of belief. In the biology of belief book, he says that you can use your mind to repair your body.
Hmm.
And he has given ample examples, including somebody who had had this huge skin infection, and only through mind positive affirmation the condition was cured. So he
Hmm.
always tried to find out if quantum physics, the particles that they behave collapsing of the wave, had anything to do with the mind. Science has not been able to answer exactly where awareness comes from.
Hmm.
When you have chemicals, you have atoms, you have cells, you have organic things, you have brain. How does matter result in non-material consciousness,
Right.
awareness? How are thoughts produced? Thoughts are not substances. Brain is a substance. Thought is
Hmm.
not a substance. So there is always this question of where does the awareness comes from. So I believe that there's a very huge link between quantum physics, especially the collapsing of the wave. Particle at a very, very small scale has no definite position.
Hmm.
It could be, there's only possibility of positions.
Hmm.
Okay, myriad of possibility of position. There is this 53% chance that this electron is here, a 37% chance that it is here, like that. There are only possibilities. It's always in a wave. But the minute somebody sees it, the somebody tries to measure it, it collapses and becomes a particle. So this is called
Hmm.
the collapsing of the wave, and therefore you have this concept of multiverse, that each probability has a universe. In this universe, Mohan is talking to Justin. In another universe, Mohan is doing something else. So there is this multiverse concept too that is coming. So my understanding is that a deep study, not necessarily deep, at least basic understanding of the collapsing of the way of
Hmm.
entanglement, how particles are entangled even at infinite distances, is very essential and crucial in understanding the way that humans behave too. In time
Yeah.
to come, they will definitely discover that.
And I think it's remarkable too that you took elements of your past from your deep understanding of physiology and
Mhm.
in your background in pharmaceuticals, but also as an engineer. So with the science and the way the engineering or systems or systemic view, to put it that way, obviously your background with Hinduism and then your own study of other areas. And what it comes out of this is a set of practices that are not different, I would say. Like if we were to look on the surface of what you're teaching people around kind of the actual practices of Amopia, is the things like breath work or meditation, and but it's the way that you're doing it, and we're going to get into that in another conversation. But the point of it, all of it adds up to, and I guess this leads to a question, is that Amopia is a philosophy, but it's also a community. It's a course. It's a set of programs, and people can see all of what we're putting together at Amopia. Which was actually, the website was launched on December 9th, 2024. Was Yogita's, in honor of Yogita. So it will probably be forever in the legacy of Amopia, the birth of Amopia, on celebrating on the day that Yogita passed away. And so you're building something that is, like you said, a movement, and it's a set of principles and set of practices and everything. But what do you want people to get out of it on the other side of it? They do all of this and they go through and they take the course, or maybe they hire you to coach them, or however they choose to absorb the information. What do you want them to get out of it?
I want them to be prepared and ready in the way that you keep weapons at home for an intruder,
Mm-hmm.
for self-defense. So I want to equip and arm people with the wherewithal of dealing with events, adversities,
Mm-hmm.
negative events as they call them, and be ready and embrace that instead of trying to avoid it or running away from it. When there is a deep grief of the loss of a friend, or when there is a betrayal for somebody, I want them to be prepared that this is happening, and this is happening, that I need to have be grounded. I need to understand and observe what is happening, and I'll not be able to make out anything now, but it is going to definitely happening for a reason. And I want people to embrace that what life throws at them, and to embrace what life throws at them instead of calling them negative. They should be equipped. So I want to equip and arm the world
Mm-hmm.
with the principles, with the practices of Amopia, and
Mm-hmm.
form a community so that it gets propagated, it becomes a way of life. Okay.
But to what end? What is the the
For that, definitely
collective
for a
result
much
of that,
more accepting, peaceful, and happier life.
right? But to what
Okay,
end? There's a reason for it.
what do you
Like
mean
imagine
reason?
that. So imagine this, Mo, that over the next 100 years, 10 to Amopia becomes a known legacy movement with,
I want Amopia to embrace the whole world.
right. So it does. So it embraces the whole world. How will it transform the world as we see it collectively?
World will no longer term events in life as negative or positive. World will no longer look at life in binary terms. World will no longer try to sidestep suffering.
Right.
World will no longer mourn death. Instead, they will embrace it. They are not going to celebrate it, but they are definitely going to understand it. World is going to understand the meaning behind pain. Okay? And they will understand that God is not the one who does mass suffering. Suffering, well, there is an earthquake or there's an inordinate event, you cannot make anything out of it because God has no plans. You have to understand that when there is an earthquake or when there is a war or whatever, when people die, God suffers with you
Mm-hmm.
because God is in all of us. He
Mm-hmm.
suffers with us. So if you think that you are suffering, what about God, who is
Mm-hmm.
very much in you? So world
Yeah.
should understand that these events happen and happen for a thing that is beyond our comprehension. And the
Yeah.
way to deal with it, equip ourselves, be ready for it, and understand this is all has a larger purpose, far larger than what your experiences are.
Mm. Yeah. And part of my deep emotional and spiritual investment in this with you, and you and I've talked about this. This is far beyond a client relationship. It's why I basically left behind a successful branding practice and decided to go off and find people like you or my friend and client in Seattle, Massimo, or Mark Dilcom, excuse me, from Divine All Along, who you've met. It's that there's these people being kind of called forth out of their own struggles to create as Eckhart Tolle referred to, like a whole new earth. But I look at it from this perspective, and this is just my editorializing on my podcast, that right now, our relationship with suffering, which is goes all the way back to some of the Stoics, and I can't remember which one that it said. It could have been Epicurus or Epictetus, excuse me, that said that we suffer far more in our imagination than our reality.
Yeah,
And when we have that kind of existential suffering, we are easy to control.
yeah,
We are easy to control because powers, low conscious powers, can use our fears to control us. Well, if we're liberated from that kind of fear, we're very difficult to control. Like Alan Watts says, one of the worst things that can happen to religion is a outbreak of mystics, because
no,
yeah,
you cannot eliminate that fear, Justin. The fear
no,
will
what
be
I mean
there.
is the existential aspect of it. That's my point. I think if you embrace the principles of Amopia and the practices, I've seen it within
Mhm.
myself. There is a significant reduction of existential fear that it will be what it will be.
Exactly, absolutely. You bang on.
Then there's the deeper suffering of like grief, let's say grief and that tragedy, like you experienced with Yogita or my daughter-in-law and my son when she lost her father and mom and little sister in a plane crash suddenly, almost 3 years ago. Like there's no Amopia as a philosophy is not meant to like justify that. It is meant to, this concept of Amopia, whatever you've been through, is to frame it as something that if you see it as a teacher, it doesn't take away the horribleness of what happened, but it does frame it or present it in a way that really grounds you in reality. And
Yeah,
I think so many of us, especially in the United States, we live in a hologram of that's not real. That's based off of the algorithm and social conditioning and clickbait and the pressure to and consumerism and retail therapy and like you can go on and on and on. And what I believe is that there's so many people that are secretly suffering that when they find Amopia, they'll be like this when the student is willing, the teacher appears. This is like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. So
Yep.
I want to end with a disclaimer because it's important. The disclaimer is, and this is on your website too, that Amopia as a set of practices is not intended to be a resource if you are in an active, violent, or abusive situation.
No, of course not. Yep.
Right.
You
And
need you. Yeah. You
yeah,
have a severe
this is not,
existential crisis.
yes,
You need to go see
or
a
a literal
psychiatrist.
crisis, right.
Yep.
There are resources for that. Sadly, whether you're going through existential suffering or you're going through like grief and tragedy type suffering, when there's still this expectation that you're just supposed to get over it. And what you're presenting is you don't get over it, you get with it.
Yep.
You
And
become
there
friends
is
with it
no point
almost.
in saying this should not have happened, that should not
Yes.
have happened,
Right.
if only. It's all
Yeah.
pointless, meaningless.
Right. Exactly. So, well, there's much more to come with this. I'm going to put links to the website and your first book, Intertrek. I'm going to encourage people. There's going to be a sign up form to join the community when the community opens. And then, of course, Myopia, when the book Myopia comes out, I'm going to do another episode with you to talk more about specifically the book. But thank you for the doing what we do. We just turned the cameras on.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you for this. Thank
All
you
right.
for making Amopia go where it has gone.
Yeah, I can't
Thank
wait
you.
to share more of it with the world.
Thank you, Justin.